Welcome back to our Essential Vectors series sponsored by Avemco Insurance. My name is Gene Benson. In this edition, we will look at some essential information regarding the forced landing. A loss of engine power in a single-engine airplane leads to the unpowered approach, or what is commonly called the forced landing. Statistically, most pilots taking this course fly single-engine airplanes, and that is what we will concentrate on. But even multi-engine jets are not completely immune from the possibility of a power loss. As for general aviation, an engine failure in a light, multi-engine airplane is statistically more likely to result in a fatality than an engine failure in a single-engine airplane. The loss of control is a much bigger factor in the multi-engine airplane, and I would encourage all pilots who fly multi-engine airplanes to take some refresher training on engine-out procedures. That's especially true if it has been more than a year since the last refresher. But anyway, let's take a few minutes and discuss what happens when it gets a bit too quiet in the cockpit. We will limit our discussion to single-engine general aviation airplanes. Let's also note that this is a rather complex area and that this video will discuss only the major points. Also, nothing presented in this program is intended to contradict anything published by the aircraft manufacturer or by the FAA. The final guidance as to practices and procedures must come from the aircraft manufacturer and/or the FAA. Our first thought, of course, is to do everything we can to prevent a power loss. You know what is the most frequent cause of power loss in general aviation airplanes? It's actually too much air. That is, of course, too much air in the fuel tanks. In other words, fuel exhaustion is the number one cause of power loss in general aviation airplanes. Part of that is actually fuel management, or having fuel aboard the airplane but operating on a tank that does not contain the fuel. The remedy for that is good pre-flight planning, including when to switch tanks, and also good tracking of time and fuel consumption as we fly. Another major player in the cause of power loss is carburetor ice. There seems to be an increasing trend here for all airplanes equipped with float-type carburetors, but particularly in the case of amateur-built airplanes. We must always do thorough pre-flight inspection that includes a watchful eye for any evidence of mechanical problems. Be sure to check the fuel and oil quantities. The engine will not run without fuel, but it also won't run for very long without oil. Look for evidence of any oil leaks. Little oil leaks can become big oil leaks and result in engine failure. Of course, engines quit because of mechanical problems also. There is no way to absolutely prevent mechanical problems, but strictly adhering to maintenance regulations and the manufacturer's service bulletins and the FAA airworthiness directives can go a long way to avoid that deafening quiet. We must remember that power loss is always a possibility. Flight plan with the possibility of a power loss in mind. Avoid flight over unsurvivable terrain if possible. Carry flotation gear for overwater flights. Be prepared to spend the night in any terrain that will be overflown. Have at least a minimal survival kit and first aid kit. Make sure ELT and battery are in good order, and file a flight plan. Remember that altitude is your friend. Remember that one of the most useless things in aviation is the altitude above you. We might suffer a complete power loss, or we might find that we have partial power still available. Of course, a complete power loss of engine power in a single-engine airplane means that we will be executing a landing real soon. A partial power loss, depending on its severity and whether or not the problem is getting worse, may or may not allow us to make it to an airport. The single most important thing a pilot can do in the event of any power loss, or any other emergency for that matter, is to maintain a safe airspeed and keep flying the airplane. A stall spin or any other loss of control issue severely reduces the chance of survivability. Since there isn't much opportunity for an approach and landing if the power loss happens immediately after takeoff, we will just say a couple of things about that and move on. Engines sometimes do lose power right after takeoff. If that happens, our choices are really pretty simple. Lower the nose to maintain safe flying speed, land straight ahead with only minor heading changes to avoid large obstacles, and avoid the temptation to turn back. The impossible turn, as it is called, is rarely successful. We are making the assumption here that there is no engine power being produced, and you have run the appropriate checklist in an effort to restart the engine. We'll assume that we have secured the airplane per the manufacturer's recommendations. The fuel is off, the master switch is off, the mag switch is off, and we are at best glide speed. We have selected a landing site considering terrain, obstacles, wind direction, and accessibility for emergency equipment. How about that shoulder harness? Snug it up and direct your passengers to do the same with theirs. The NTSB has concluded that the risk of fatal or serious injury is 50% higher when an occupant was only restrained by a lap belt as compared to the combination lap belt and shoulder harness. Our objective is to survive. Assume that the airplane is now the property of the insurance company. Occupant survival is primary. The best chance of survival is to put the airplane down under control and avoid impacts as much as possible. Obviously, a nice landing in a grassy field is ideal, but we might have to land in trees, a swamp, or in a populated area. The key is to find a way to let the airplane decelerate as gently as possible. Going into the tops of trees is preferable to hitting big tree trunks. Be especially watchful for wires. Wires are very difficult to see from an airplane, but wires are usually supported by poles. If you see poles, there are probably wires strung between them. What if it's at night? Obviously, a forced landing at night is less than optimal. What about landing on a road? That question will start a lively discussion at the airport cafe. I guess it depends on the road. First, roads are magnets for wires, so watch out for those poles. Some country roads are just not wide enough. I live on a road with poles up both sides and wires frequently crossing from side to side. There is no way a Cessna 172 could successfully land on my road. The bigger roads are attractive landing sites, but they also have more traffic. Successful landings on larger roads have been done in the past. Of course, try to land with the traffic and turn off into the median or toward the side as soon as practical. We want to touch down with the slowest possible forward speed, which of course means landing into the wind if possible. We cannot address all the possibilities here, but it is worth giving it some thought on one of those non-flyable days. How far can the airplane glide with no engine power? The biggest factor in determining that is, of course, how high is the airplane above the terrain. I will stress again, altitude is our friend. A couple thousand feet of extra altitude will expand our potential glide radius significantly. It will also add a few extra minutes to allow us to run a checklist, get the airplane properly configured, brief passengers, or maybe even resolve the problem and get the power restored. But most single-engine GA airplanes can glide at least a third the distance to the horizon in a no-wind condition, and that is also allowing for a bit of maneuvering to get lined up with the wind before touchdown. Look all around when you're trying to figure out the best place to land. Remember that airports or other wide-open spaces while we're flying, and of course if GPS equipped, don't forget to hit the nearest airport functions. You never know, there might be an airport within gliding distance. Where I live in western New York State, there are many small private airports on the charts that are in the GPS databases that are not suitable for use in the winter or in muddy spring, but at least they are open stretches of land, relatively free of obstacles. It is sure better to land in snow or mud and flip over than it is to go down in trees. A forced landing is one of the few things we cannot safely practice nor accurately simulate in the airplane. It is just not safe to shut down our engine in flight. And unfortunately, it is very difficult to simulate the effects of the engine out. Closing the throttle is the common method, but there is still not as much drag from the prop as if the engine was actually quit and windmilling. Much less drag is produced by the stopped prop. That's why multi-engine airplanes that might continue to fly after an engine failure have feathering capability on the props. But in the single-engine airplane, the prop may or may not be windmilling. If the power was lost because of fuel exhaustion, for example, the prop will probably continue to windmill right up until touchdown. But if the engine quits because of a lubrication problem, the engine may seize, causing the prop to stop. To simulate this, we can keep just a little bit of power on in an attempt to replicate a zero thrust condition. But it is impossible to know exactly how much power to keep on. So the bottom line is, unless you have access to very accurate simulation, a forced landing will be your first attempt at a maneuver that has little margin for error. I guess that illustrates why we should take every possible precaution to make sure the engine doesn't lose power during flight. So to summarize, we want to prevent the loss of engine power by having good maintenance and doing good pre-flight planning. We want to plan our flight to avoid unfriendly terrain if possible. We want to have as much altitude below us as is practical given airplane limitations and weather conditions. If we encounter a power loss, we want to have some items committed to memory, and we want to have a checklist readily available for the remainder of our items. Above all else, we must maintain a safe airspeed and continue to fly the airplane. We want to make a smart choice of a landing spot, considering what is available all the way around the airplane. We want to have everybody aboard securely strapped in with lap belts and shoulder harnesses. And finally, we want to touch down at the lowest possible forward speed to minimize impact forces. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Avemco Insurance for their sponsorship. For much more safety-related material, please check out our website, vectorsforsafety.com, and please remember to fly like your life depends on it. I'm Gene Benson.